Let me say that I am blessed to be here, but the crucial theme today is solidarity. We are in it together. We're focusing on the suffering of those friends who know called the wretched of the earth, and nothing is going to stop us, no matter how catastrophic the situation is, and no matter how dim and grim it looks. So I want to begin with an epigraph from the great W.B. Du Bois, the greatest public intellectual in the history of the American Empire. He was there at the founding of the United Nations in San Francisco, and on the way back on June 27th, 1945, he wrote in the Chicago Defender, the leading black newspaper of the day, June 27th, 1945, called The Winds of Time. He said, I envision, he almost says with tears in my eyes, I envision the emerging of a third world war, with the American empire attempting to suppress Asia and stranglehold Russia. Why? In part, the legacy of the colonies. The truncated character of the United Nations. And he made his way all the way to New York. And he told his very good friend, Paul Robeson, that we have got to launch an anti-war movement. But that anti-war movement must be but a moment in an anti-imperialist project, an anti-imperialist vision, an anti-imperialist analysis, an anti-imperialist praxis in the name of solidarity, which means it's going to cut across a whole lot of folk who disagree with each other, but they'll be in the same streets and go to the same jails. Oh yes, and that's what's so deeply, deeply needed. Because W. Du Bois and Paul Robeson understood that so much of the history of the species is the history of organized greed and hatred and avarice and resentment and envy, structures of domination, oppression, subjugation, and unbelievable exploitation. And all we've ever had as a species are moments of interruption, moments of eruption. And that's when everyday people straighten their backs up. And any time everyday people straighten their backs up, they're going somewhere, because the ruling class can't ride your back unless it's bent. That's courage. All the virtues in the world are empty and shallow and hollow unless you don't have courage, which is the enabling virtue. And if we have any talk about an anti-war movement, any talk about an anti-imperialist vision, analysis, and praxis, we have to have people who are in solidarity, who get beyond their petty differences and be able to hold hands symbolically and literally and fight by straightening your backs up. I used to play organ in my church on the chocolate side of Sacramento, Shiloh Baptist Church, named Sylvester, but the world knows him for the genius that he is. His name is Sly Stone. He wrote a song called Stand. You've been sitting much too long. There's a permanent crease in your right and wrong. Stand, there's a cross for you to bear. Things to go through if you going anywhere. Second epigraph comes from Martin Luther King Jr. That's the same Martin Luther King Jr. was in that paddy wagon for 4.5 hours when he rode from Atlanta to Reidsville prison. And Daddy King told me, he said, when Martin, my son, got out, he couldn't walk a straight line. German shepherds had disoriented him, so he didn't know when he was going to be bitten. He didn't know when he was going to be pushed against the wall. He couldn't walk one line, and all he could say was, Daddy, this is the cross we must bear for the freedom of our people. That's the cross that Sly was talking about. There is no serious sacrifice or burden that we have to bear that will not allow us to sustain our solidarity, to create moments of interruption here and around the world in light of the war machine coming out of the U.S. empire. It's not just a matter of how grand your vision and how splendid it is. It's not just a matter of how subtle and sophisticated your analysis. If you're not willing to throw down, put your body where your words are. Brother Jim knows we've been to jail so many times with Carl Dixon and others. And what Martin said was, my own government is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. When he said it, he'd already signed his death certificate. But he understood he'd rather be dead than afraid. He'd rather be a corpse than a coward. That's what we're talking about. Because the gangsters who run the American empire, they'll do anything to preserve their entrenched interest. They'll do anything to procure their profits. They'll do anything in the names of lies and crimes and mendacity and criminality to trivialize the suffering of precious brothers and sisters around the world, but who are disproportionately chocolate. And each life is equal. Each life has the same value and significance. But I'm still an old school revolutionary Christian like Martin King. Believe that every human being, every baby, it could be a baby in on the West Bank, it could be a baby in Argentina, it could be a baby in Ukraine, it could be a baby in Moscow, it could be a baby in Puerto Rico, it could be a baby in Guatemala, it could be a baby in Idaho. Say that in the name of Ezra Pound. He's from Idaho. Great poet, but fascist. Things are complicated in the world. But the important point is that we have to have that kind of moral consistency and ethical constancy. It could be a precious young Iranian sister dealing with suppression in Iran. It could be brothers and sisters in Mississippi. And that's where the third epigraph comes from. The last speech that Malcolm X gave outside of New York City, February 16, 1965 in Rochester. Went back to the city of Frederick Douglass. And you get a chance to read that powerful speech. And what did he talk about? He talked about war. He implicitly invoked Karl von Clausewitz, philosopher of war, and his text on war, published in 1832, a year after he died by his wife. He said, nobody wants to talk about war. He says, I've been in this struggle now for 12 years, ever since I got out of the prison, and I was in it before the prison, but I didn't know it was Malcolm Little. He said, there's been a war going on against indigenous peoples for 400 years. There's been a war going on against black folk in Africa, black folk in Rochester, brown folk in Mexico. And he added, a lot of people don't like to acknowledge this about Malcolm, because Malcolm said, I'm for truth, anybody who says it, I'm for justice, anybody who promotes it, but I'm first and foremost a human being, a black man, and a Muslim. So that's about as humanistic as you can get with his own deep religious twist. And he said, we need to talk honestly, candidly about the levels of war. Because some of us come from a people who have had to have armor of spiritual and political and tremendous cultural power in the face of multi-layered wars. I'm a black man who come from black people who for 400 years dealing with white supremacist bombardment, every day mediated with predatory capitalist processes, shot through with male supremacist and homophobic and transphobic practices too. And if you don't get yourself together, you're going to give up real quick. You're going to cave in real fast. You're going to sell out and act as if you're in the vanguard for struggle for something bigger than just your narcissistic ego and agenda. The wars of Cop City. You can't separate Mexican brothers and sisters trying to get into California from 1846 when the U.S. Empire stole half of Mexico. Some of them just coming home. They ain't got the memo yet. That was an illegal war. It was an immoral war. That's still Mexico. Absolutely. Even Ulysses S. Grant writes about it in the memoir. It was a phoniest war, and he was in the war as a lieutenant and hadn't even become general in the Civil War yet. It's interesting how some of these folk begin to tell the truth after. You know, like the war criminal Henry Kissinger. Well, we didn't have anything to do with Chile, you know, it just was accidental that they overthrew it, and they quit lying. Yeah. And then in the memoir, yeah, of course, CIA was fundamental, it was fundamental, absolutely. I'm going to say the same thing about Julian Assange. Oh, yes, exposing the vicious crimes of the American empire. Same thing about Snowden. Same thing about Mumia Abu-Jamal. Same thing about H. Rap Brown and Hamid. Same thing about Leonard Peltier. Same thing about folks who told the truth. And sooner or later, truth crushed earth will rise again. No lie can live forever. So part of our challenge is to understand the backdrop. 1492, beginning of the Europeanization of the world, when those small nations between the Ural Mountains and the Atlantic Ocean began to reshape the whole globe in their interest and in their image owing to their imperial power. And this contestation of those European empires leading toward what? The end of the age of Europe in 1945 with the most indescribable catastrophic consequences. And most visibly in so many ways within Europe, the inability to come to terms with the precious Jewish brothers and sisters given the unbelievable anti-Jewish hatred that was unleashed. Not just by Nazis in Germany, there's a long history of it throughout Europe. Throughout Europe. And Europe ends up a divided, dependent, deferential continent to two empires, the Soviet Empire on the one hand and the U.S. Empire on the other. And with now the Americanization of the world and with the American empire in such unbelievable decline and decay, undeniable. Look on the streets, social housing versus real estate development. Gentrification ain't nothing but land grab and power grab, just another cycle of what an imperial project is all about. It's just urban. Look in the hearts and minds and souls of our fellow citizens wrestling with levels of despair and despondency, with escalating suicides and escalating drug overdoses, making it difficult even to cultivate the very capacity to love, because love itself is a magnificent interruption in the history of the species, given the history of lust and manipulation and domination tied to vicious forms of male supremacy and other such realities. One of the reasons why black folk talk so much about love, when you've been hated like us, love is liberation. Love is emancipation. Love is subversive. Love is revolutionary. To be bombarded for 400 years and told you have the wrong hips and lips and noses and hair pigmentation and told you're less beautiful and less moral and less intelligent, and then you still have to straighten your back up. But you can't talk about peace unless you're talking about the presence of justice. And justice is what love looks like in public. It is. Just like cultivating the capacity for intimacy, tenderness is what love feels like in private. You can't have a movement if you don't have tenderness and kindness in your solidarity, even as you have deep disagreement. And for some of us, we just want to make it soulful. I'm not talking about being on or off the beat. No. Our musicians are the vanguard of our movement. Musicians are the vanguard of the species. And they understand the soul ain't nothing but the sharing of a soothing sweetness against the backdrop of a grim catastrophe. That's what Strange Fruit is all about. Mary Pole's Jewish Brothers lyrics and the genius from Baltimore City, Billie Holiday, singing about catastrophe. Not a problem, a catastrophe. Looking for what? Justice, tied to peace. And one of the sadder things during the Obama years, one of the reasons why so many of us who were critical of Brother Barack understood it was not just about policy. There was a time in which the black community was the most anti-war community in the history of the American empire. But here comes Barack Obama dropping 71 bombs every day, 26,117 in 1 year in 7 countries, walking around with the Nobel Peace Prize. Sweat moment, something just ain't right. Lies, the dissonance, the hypocrisy of it all. What has that got to do with Ukraine, Brother West? Everything. Because if we're not talking about an anti-imperial vision and project, as my dear sister and others noted, if we're not talking about demilitarization tied to decommodification, tied to decolonization, leading toward wholesale democratization so that everyday people's voices can be lifted to shape their destinies, to get the oligarchs and the plutocrats off of their backs. And no matter how strong our anti-war movement is, we don't go somewhere else. Because so much of this is precisely about human survival, as my dear. That's what it's about. The self-destructive tendencies of the human species. We are a wretched species. Oh, that's pessimistic. No. That's retail pessimism. That's not wholesale pessimism. I'm a blues man. Blues not pessimistic, not optimistic. What is it? Prisoners of hope. Because you have to do something. Can't just talk about it. Sing your song. Engage in your practice. Create your solidarity. Sustain what you're trying to do. That's what we're talking about. How do we demilitarize to keep track of the precious suffering of Ukrainian brothers and sisters, but understand the NATO expansion not simply was a provocation, but it part and parcel of an overall pattern of U.S. imperial activity that's been going on for decades and decades and decades. Pentagon been invaded 22 times. What are we talking about? Cuba 6 times. What are we talking about? Haiti. Looks like there's going to be another occupation coming. To fight it. How do we keep track? Vision, analysis, not be overwhelmed by it, but like blues folk, look the catastrophe in the face and not allow it to have the last word. Yeah. Oh, that's it. That's it. B.B. King said, nobody loves me but my... That's catastrophic. All the forces of the world and the cosmos against you. The one person you thought in your corner. Now that the whole planet has the blues, the whole nation has the blues. If we don't learn something from the best of a blues people, we lose everything. The species, life on the planet, the sliver of democracy that's still limping along, given the ways in which poverty and militarism and materialism, forms of racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia and so forth are squeezing out the best of our democracy. And sometimes all you can do is do what our magnificent artists did to start this program, is do what? Sing a song. Sing a song. Our precious Hasidic brothers and sisters used to always say, in the face of the morning of catastrophe, you weep, you're silent, and you sing a song. I come from a tradition where the spirit will not descend without song. So in all of our analysis, and you've heard the data, 800 military bases, 85 countries, special operations, 160-some countries, 3,829 military units in the United States. China got one in Djibouti, but they're supposed to be so imperialist. Ain't attacked nobody for hundreds of years. And that doesn't mean that China doesn't have its repressive elites. I'm with my Muslim brothers and sisters when they mistreated the Uyghur people. You got to be morally consistent. But Chinese imperialism pales in the face of the largest empire in the history of the species. 68th empire. There's been 70 empires since the empires emerged out of Africa. The United States is number 68. It's done the most damage in treating human beings as if they do not matter. How many precious Iraqis did we invade, occupy, kill, annihilate? And nobody says, not nobody in the powers that be say a mumbling word. Reminds me of the unbelievable cowardliness of these same politicians. They can't say a mumbling word when 551 Palestinian babies are killed in 51 days, and all you can talk about is Israel has a right to defend itself. Please, where's your morality? Where's your spirituality? Where's your truth-telling? Where's your gift? What happens when it comes to your house? What happens when a catastrophe comes to your neighborhood and all of a sudden you want to be on the cutting edge of morality? That's, I hope, the raw stuff of this new moment of an anti-war momentum and possible movement. It takes a lot to create a movement now. You just can't call for it. You got to build it. But it has to be a moment within a larger anti-imperialist vision and analysis so that there could be possibly a new world. Thank you all so very much.